Welcome to the Tamarind Learning Podcast, where host Dr. Kirby Ross-Plock speaks with experts on many topics relevant in the ultra-high net worth family wealth management space. Kirby is author of several books, including The Complete Family Office Handbook, and shares her expertise consulting with families and family offices. Kirby is also the founder of Tamarind Learning, an online wealth education platform that develops practical, foundational learning programs for beneficiaries to help them prepare for responsible stewardship of wealth.
Welcome to the Tamarind Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirby Ross-Plock, and today we're talking about autonomy and accountability and the roles and responsibilities around a trust. And I'm thrilled to have Dr. Jim Grubman with me here today. He is a senior consultant to many multi-generational families and their advisors about the issues often arising around wealth. Jim is also author of several books and lots of lectures and keynotes and speaking appearances. His former life, he was a clinical psychologist, or he still is a psychologist and neuropsychologist. And then he transitioned from the healthcare space into the field of wealth management and has been a luminary for so many of our peers. Jim, it's great to have you here today. Thank you so much for being on the Tamarind Learning Podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. And I think we can have a great conversation about something that's really important to families.
So let's get into it, because so many families are struggling with and trying to face how do they relate to their beneficiaries around issues of autonomy, them really wanting their independence and to be separate, but at the same time to be accountable. Maybe they're, inheriting significant wealth or business interests, and there can be a lot of tension between those two criteria. What are your thoughts?
When I work with families, I have heard this over and over again throughout my career, and I began to realize in many design of trusts, for many often, generation one founders and whatever, when they work with their lawyers, everybody's focused on, we have to make sure the beneficiaries are going to be responsible. We got to make sure that they know there are limits on this. We got to make sure that, they handle things responsibly, because, money can destroy people and they can lose motivation. There's all these fear-driven, catastrophic sorts of things that we got to control. And when I talk with beneficiaries, what I hear is, why are there strings attached? My trustee looks over my shoulder on everything. My father or my grandfather used to do the same thing. I wish they would back off, because I actually handle things well. They just don't pay attention to that. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And when I work with family meetings, I can think of one family in particular that I worked with. We were in a family meeting talking about the design of a trust, and there were arguments. And if you can imagine, like, one side was pounding the table for autonomy, leave us alone, let us run our own lives, stop interfering and telling us what we're going to do. And the other side was pounding the table for accountability. Yeah, but we need to know that you're handling it responsibly. If we just give you a blank check, keys to the kingdom, you can do anything you want. And I didn't earn all this money just so that you could run off and do that. So accountability, autonomy, back and forth as attention. And what I help them see is that actually it is not a tension or a fight. It is a balance, that finding together across the generations, the balance of how do you balance autonomy with accountability in a reasonable way, and can we come together to design it, is what families have to do. And when I've seen trusts designed quite well for that, everybody is happier, and the beneficiaries in particular do much better.
You were sharing with me a little bit earlier about sort of an analogy, a car analogy. Maybe you could give our listeners and viewers a taste of that, because I think it so visually captures sort of the relationship maybe that families need to think about that trust in a car sort of metaphor.
Well, you know me, I'm a car guy, and I often think of car metaphors, analogies. If you imagine that the main asset of a trust is a car, say a really nice car. In a lot of trust designs, in what's called the ascertainable standard or the health, education, maintenance, and support, the HEM standard, as you know, basically the equivalent is like, well, the trustee comes, the beneficiary comes to the trustee and says, I want the car. And the trustee looks at the trust document, says, okay, well, what do you want the car for? And as long as the beneficiary can say, well, it's because I want to go to the doctor, or I want to go to school, or I want to do something or other, some purpose, the trustee says, okay, then you can use the car. And it sometimes relates to games playing, where as long as beneficiaries can shoehorn the purpose into one of those four things with the HEM standard, they get the car. With incentive trusts, which I generally hate, it's the other way around. The trustee says, well, I'll tell you what, if you go to college, I'll give you a car. If you live in a certain area or you work and do something, I'll give you the car. And so, of course, the beneficiary will do it. What I tend to talk with families about is, wait a minute, it's the wrong question. If the beneficiary wants to use the car, the trustee and the beneficiary need to know is, can you drive? Do you have the skills to drive a car? If you do, perfectly fine. If you keep crashing cars and you have a demonstrated inability to drive a car well, then actually, maybe not. And so it's a very different focus, focusing on skills, focusing on the fact that accountability is a reasonable thing in life. We are accountable to act responsibly. And so when beneficiaries accept that accountability is a value, is an appropriate thing, and they want to live up to it, often it's a lot easier than to gain autonomy.
Well, and maybe also there's a yes and. I mean, maybe we can work together, parties to a trust, working with, grantors' vision, if they're still here, even get their sort of views and ideas, but also get the idea of what's the spirit of this trust, what's intended to do, to co-create. What does it mean to be accountable? What does it mean to have autonomy? And can't we maybe move down a path that helps achieve all parties with a reasonable expectation that's achievable and isn't too onerous, but at the same time isn't saying we're letting the beneficiary drive with their hands off the wheel. We're also not saying to the trustee, you have to accept and okay everything so they can be autonomous. So, I mean, I think maybe there are solutions. It's just how families approach the conversation and expand it beyond what they know today. Because sometimes we get limited by sort of where we are today in the conversations we've had historically. And we maybe have models that have worked or not worked, and that we need to sort of rethink how to reframe and bring in professionals like yourself and others to start to expand the possibility that will work for the future, not where we've come from, right?
Exactly. And listening to you, I was reminded, I once did a family meeting with 3 generations, in which one of the things that they were working on was there was some new estate planning going on, and they were talking about how the trusts might be designed and what the provisions might be. And I facilitated the conversation across the generations where grandma and grandpa in particular were able to share their fears. It's like, we're afraid. You guys have not come from the kind of scarcity and difficult things that we had. We're concerned. We want to make sure that you know and are going to handle this money well, because it was very difficult to make it. And ironically, G2 and G3 in particular, what they talked about was they wanted to participate in designing the accountability. They said, well, actually, most of them said, we see it as reasonable. We're afraid too. We want to work with you to design criteria. And what was really interesting was that there was a 1G3 who was a bit of an overspender, was a little entitled, and everybody was kind of worried about her. And she argued against it. She says, no, we need to have our autonomy. And she pounded the table for autonomy. What was interesting was it was not G1 or even G2 that talked about limits. It was her cousins, the G3s, who turned to her and said, no, that's not right. Limits are appropriate and understandable. We have a duty to honor the legacy that was created with such difficulty. We do need limits. And it was her cousins who set limits and said, we are not going to have unlimited autonomy and no accountability. And so they understood that overspending was not part of the legacy, and they supported there being reasonable accountability. And the family walked away from that meeting in a whole different place.
That's such a powerful story, and so it just illuminates the power, right, of family involvement, participation, and maybe sometimes the unexpected, right? Maybe her cousins didn't expect her cousins to sort of show up and present. She probably expected some of that language maybe to come from more elder generation. And so I do always find it remarkable how smart families become in the moment that they need to be great, right? They need to step up and rise. And I think for beneficiaries, it's a powerful conversation to figure out how to be positive and open-minded, but also recognize that accountability helps all parties, because you want your trustee to be accountable, you want the investment advisors and professionals around your trust to be accountable for their role, and it's really no different as a beneficiary. And I think you don't have to feel like you have to sacrifice all of autonomy just because that's maybe a model that in the past you couldn't be independent, you couldn't have your own path. In fact, a lot of really, really successful beneficiaries have grown up, done very well for themselves, also been supported in part by a trust, and can manage. They can find a healthy balance. So, Jim, I am so grateful for your time today on this Tamarind Learning podcast, and I really enjoyed speaking with you, getting your wisdom, and again, I want all the listeners and viewers today to go check out Jim's website, his books. He's got some fantastic books, and hopefully you'll get as inspired as I am today with having him here as a guest.
Well, thank you for having me, Kirby. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks.